All right. So this is probably going to be the most ambitious task I'm about to do here. And probably insane. I'm not entirely sure, but okay, so as you guys can see here, the presentation is called Object Impressions / Illusions and New Questions. So I've been reading some of the interpretation of dreams by Sigmund Freud, right? And I'm not finished with the book, so there's already going to be some things that I miss. But I don't think Freud's going to go too deep into external object stimuli, which is why I'm going to talk about it now. Because I can tell already he's concerned about, psychic sources for explanation of dreams. Okay, well, so to kind of introduce this subject and to kind of ease ourselves into the questions that I'm going to raise and kind of new hypothesis that I'm going to spark up from this, is that Freud finds one of the sources for dreams, and he labels it external object stimuli. Basically, the way, when you look at this graph that I put here, kind of make it really easy, is there's the object, the sense impression upon the subject, and then it creates a dream image. Examples are given throughout the passage, but what's really striking is Maury's alarm clock dreams that Freud talks about, where Maury has the same object, the same sense impression, but three different manifestations from the dream itself, right? So basically, three different dream images, right? One was the little village bell, the sleigh bells, and the kitchen maid dropping plates. Now, why does the external object stimuli fail for Freud? Well, it doesn't account for everything in the dream, right? And it's obviously not the sole source for dreams. It seems like Freud, he acknowledges that this can account in some sense for an aspect of the dream, but clearly not all of the dream, and so on. But, and again, what's so interesting about this? Well, even though it kind of gets tucked under the rug because Freud is looking for more of a psychical source for dreams, or a more in-depth explanation for dreams, I thought that even not this, paying attention to this, I thought was actually very interesting. Something that was just very small that got kind of put aside, right? And I was looking at this more and thinking about it more, and I said to myself, this is actually really interesting. The fact that one object and one sense impression can create a variety of dream images, right? And so philosophically, it's been a task to explain the one and the many, right? How do we explain variety and then unity, right? And the funny thing is, when we look at external object stimuli, I think on a very small scale, this actually does explain how one and the many could function, right? But it's interesting because even though we talk about the subject, we still don't know what the subject is, right? And I'm just keep thinking about Heidegger here. Heidegger would really critique this, right? Like, we still don't know what that is, right? We don't know what this self is, and so on, right? So this brings me back to the idea of the mystic's mirror, right? And so I'm going to quote Eckhart and Ibn Arabi here. And so let's start with Eckhart, right? The eye with which I see God is the same one with which God sees me. My eye in God's eye is one eye, and one sight, and one knowledge, and one love. Ibn Arabi here says, man is the mirror of God, and God is the mirror of man. They are two mirrors, each reflecting the other. God is the mirror of man, with man seeing himself in the divine mirror, and man is the mirror of God because he reflects his names back to him. Okay. So, because we don't know what the self is, right? We don't know what being is. I thought, you know what? Let's actually entertain the idea. Let's entertain the idea that the self can be actually a kind of mirror, right? And there are two things. Well, there's one argument that I've been making recently called my conditionality argument. If you guys want a more in-depth explanation about that, you guys can watch my responsibility drive video. But I'll just give a brief, really brief breakdown on it. And if you don't understand it still, I would suggest watching the video. So just to break it down real quick, my conditionality argument is this. I say that we can't possess anything based on the fact that conditions exist. So even if we possess being, right? Even if someone says we possess being, my argument is that the very fact that you have to meet conditions to have being actually means that you don't possess being. It is actually the other way around, meaning being somehow is like emanated through you or from you, right? You are you can be the receptacle to this. You're a receptacle to being. And this is why I also bring in the responsibility drive, which is going to be a lot to explain as well. But basically what I'm saying is whatever we are, right, and we're always driven to respond. And so that's why I call it the responsibility drive, respond, responsibility. And possession is one kind of response. But what I'm saying with the conditionality argument is that this can't be a actual response because of the very fact that conditions exist, and in order to possess something actually is to have control over it and be a master over it. We don't have master over anything because we always have to meet the conditions for being, right? Even if you create the conditions, the paradox happens immediately because now you have to meet those conditions, and again, then you no longer you are no longer a master at that immediate moment. And then that's why I introduced the whole concept of witnessing, where basically witnessing as a response and a kind of responsibility is, in a way, I'm formulating in a way to be like a mirror, right? To be, right, like when a man sort of stands in front of a actual image, a mirror of himself, he witnesses the image and he witnesses himself, right? So I'm kind of using witness as a response to be an analogy to mirror, right? But yeah, so hopefully that explains enough to kind of get a grasp of this. And the other argument that I found interesting to introduce is the very fact that many religions in general introduce life as some kind of illusion and that we need to wake up, right? Like Buddhists with the Maya, life is illusion. A lot of the Abrahamic religions make sleep as a metaphor for death. And typically, most people understand these metaphors of death like the way sleep works, right? But my problem with that is I started thinking about this whole thing about sleep and death and how religions have often compared it as a sort of metaphor or cousin to death for sleep. The one question I ask myself is, okay, but what happens when we sleep? And I came to the conclusion that, well, in sleep we dream. So what does that mean for death? And so here, as you can see in my graph, I put that I postulate, maybe death is also an image in a sense, right? Death itself is also an image. And that's really interesting. Just to even formulate that kind of thinking as, because when we sleep, we dream, right? Religion's claiming that sleep is a metaphor for death. A lot of it's often claimed that this real world is just an illusion, and so on, right? So there always seems to be like some kind of mirror aspect going on. And I find that always intriguing. But anyways, I put here death image, right? Now, I wouldn't get too hung up on the arrows, but they, for the most part, like, it's not perfect. I can tell you right now, it's definitely not perfect, but it's the best formulation I could make. And the reason why I put the subject in the center is that it seems like if we do entertain the idea based on my argument for the conditionality argument and how religions have historically referenced sleep as a metaphor for death, and also how mystics have always compared man as a sort of mini cosmos to the actual cosmos, right? A microcosm to the macrocosm. There seems to be a lot of insertion of reflection here, right? The big question is, how is this reflected? Right? How is this reflected? Which kind of makes me postulate my whole reason for the responsibility drive. It's sort of really dependent upon how you respond. And so here there is a real cost to how I'm going to say the subject mirror, how the subject mirror responds. But yeah, I don't want to go too deep into this graph. I mean, I know there's mirror, object, transcendent, death image. I think that basically explains itself by me using the sort of mystic mirror, addressing the whole mystic mirror thing, death as an image, postulating death as an image from the historical case of religions itself, and then the conditionality argument where I say that as a subject, we really can't possess anything, right? It's rather the things themselves, well, not the things themselves, but it's an illusion that we actually possess something. That's what I'm trying to say. And it's always a false response, and it's not a true response. There's something else that has a greater power. And in my opinion, I think it is... there is something to still explain between the kind of traditional object and then the object transcendent, which I haven't quite formulated that explanation, but there's a lot to think about here in general, there's just a lot to think about here. And I'm not ready for it. This is really ambitious. And, a lot of, to be honest, I really hope someone just says I'm wrong and then I could just give up, because this just seems too complicated for me. But, and then, then there's a part of me that's like, yeah, I want to be wrong so I can keep formulating things and so on. So really, I just hope that I'm just a little bit right, just a little bit right, just so I can just kind of keep going, All right. Anyways, so finally we have here back to what I was talking about: the responsibility drive, possession, witness, possession, avoidance. Okay, so I really want to talk about this picture because I want to emphasize more about this whole mirror and responsibility drive. Okay, so as you can see, when we look into the mirror, right, the image itself is not possessible. And I hope that makes sense, right? The image itself is not possessible. And it's just crazy because the person has to meet the conditions by standing in front of the mirror, right? And so in essence, he sees himself, the image, but it's not really him, right? It is him, but it isn't him. You know what I mean? And then that's his image, but it's also not really his image. Okay, because he doesn't own that image, right? It's not really his. But it is him in a sense, right? But it's also not really him, right? This is, you can get very confusing by talking this way and confusing myself, but it does say something critical here, and this is why I keep talking about the conditionality argument, because if we look at something, if we actually take this example of a man looking in the mirror and the image itself reflected from it, this really shows how we fool ourselves into thinking that we actually possess the object of desire, right? But the thing is, there's several ways to respond if there is actually a mirror at play here. If the subject is a mirror and the object of transcendence is a mirror, there's a possibility of response, which is to witness, right? Witnessing is basically a response to just see things as they are and knowing that's not yours, in a sense, right? That you can't possess it. And I haven't formulated much from that further than that, but I actually suspect that the mirror itself is a pure lack, right? It's a pure lack. Like you can't, it's so crazy because I think I said it correctly. Yeah. The mirror itself is a pure lack. Now, the thing is, if the subject is a mirror, clearly it's not a pure mirror. And this is why I come up with the responsibility drive, right? It seems to be a very conditional mirror. And this is what I'm formulating. So mirror as a pure lack, I think actually explains for why we've been trying to fill this gap, right? It's because it's a mirror. And it's like you can't, I don't know. I mean, I think there's something there. The gap as a mirror, if the gap is a mirror, that would say so much, right? And if this gap is the lack, right, and the lack is the mirror, that is something to really think about. and something that I don't have to keep thinking about myself, but yeah, I hope that I just made everything kind of worth thinking about. And and again, this all started off with just reading Freud, right? Everything just set off because I was like, this actually has the possibility of explaining one in the many. And, when we talk about death, we have to talk about dreams, right? Why is that a separate thing? If we talk about death, we got to talk about dreams. And I'm not sure if Heidegger talked about dreams enough. He did talk about death, but dreams, I think dreams are necessary for philosophical discussion. And I think dreams definitely do need to be talked about in tandem with death. Right? I think there is some kind of mirror reflection there in these two categories. Right? And how can we link the two? That's a good question. There's a lot of good questions to ask here. And there's also a lot of mistakes I could make here. It's all fine, really. My whole point is, to think something great, you got to make some great errors. So I believe someone said that. So all right, well, I hope that was enough to swallow and understand, and I will talk to you guys later.